Well, good evening. It is a joy to be back together with you this evening. I appreciate each and every one of you, your desire to serve the Lord, to grow closer to Him, to support each other as we seek to better accomplish His will in our lives each day. I want to ask you as we begin tonight, when you hear the word slavery, what comes to mind? For many in our country today, slavery is synonymous with torture, oppression, dehumanization, injustice, racism, human trafficking. The transatlantic slave trade and plantation-era South has left a dark stain and deep scar on the history of this nation that has always prided itself as the land of the free and the home of the brave. And because many today view any acknowledgement of our nation's past sins or shame for our nation's history as unpatriotic, talking about slavery from the pulpit can be somewhat taboo, or at least among white churchgoers. And it can be a painful and sensitive topic for those who might feel like the oppression of their ancestors has been swept under the rug and isn't acknowledged. But the Bible has a lot to say about slavery. And I think it's important that we do take time to consider it. The Bible was written in a world where slavery was a broadly, even universally accepted institution. By the time of the New Testament, it's estimated that about 20 to 30% of the Roman Empire was chattel slavery, and if you include indentured servitude, about 80 to 90% of the Roman Empire was in some form of servant relationship or slavery. Basically, every major empire the world has ever seen has been built by slaves in one way or another. So how does the Bible address this culturally accepted institution of slavery? Well, by those who see the word slavery as synonymous with torture, oppression, and dehumanization, the way the Bible addresses it may not meet your satisfaction. If you've been keeping up with the Bible reading throughout Deuteronomy, though, you've probably encountered a few passages that address this institution of slavery in an Old Covenant context. But my goal today is to see these passages in their proper context and see the goodness of God's character shining through them despite the brokenness of the society that they addressed. And I want to begin with a caution in questioning God's morality. Anytime that we begin positioning ourselves as judges over God's word instead of students and subjects of His word, we're treading on very dangerous ground. Whether it be in regard to slavery or gender roles or warfare or the death penalty or human sexuality, if we start to measure God's word by our own culture's definitions and standards of morality, then we have ultimately dethroned our Creator and set ourselves up in His place. We have traded the divine morality for our own human morality, the objective morality for our own subjective morality. And so I want to start with Job chapter 40. Job chapter 40, verse 7 through 9, and just to remind us where we stand in relationship to God when it comes to morality. As Job begins to question some aspects of God's morality and God's justice, God responds in Job 40, verse 7 through 9, "Dress for action like a man, I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like His?" Notice what God says to Job when he begins challenging his sense of justice is essentially, don't forget who you're talking to, Job. If the God of the Bible is the true and living God, then it is ridiculous for us to think that He created us with a more refined sense of morality than He Himself possesses. And so we need to be careful whenever we come to the Scriptures and begin questioning God's standards of morality or God's justice. Our society's sense of morality is not a safe measure to use. Isaiah chapter 5, in the days of Isaiah, he says of his society, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight." And so I think we need to begin with a caution of making sure that we aren't approaching this from a place of we know what is right and what is wrong, and now we're going to see if God knows what is right and what is wrong. If we encounter something in the scriptures that we have a moral objection to, there are two possibilities. Number one, I may not be understanding it in the proper context. And I will say, I think primarily what we're going to look at this evening is going to fit that category. But there's another option, and that's my sense of morality needs to be adjusted. And so as I said, as it applies to slavery, I think what we're going to encounter is primarily the first issue. I may not be understanding what is said about slavery in the scriptures in the proper context. And so I hope that we can better understand the Bible's presentation of God's law, even under the Old Covenant, regarding slavery. But we need to be prepared to let God show us what is moral and immoral, not prepared to stand in judgment over him. But the first thing as we look at the Old Covenant scriptures regarding slavery is we need to recognize the law often regulated without endorsing. We're going to focus primarily on the Old Law today. And this is not the law for all time. This is not the law that we are under today, but it was a law delivered to the Jews by our Creator. And it does in many ways teach us about his character, as we saw today. But look in Matthew 19 with me for a moment. Because I think this passage will help us understand the lens through which we should read some of what we see in the Old Law. In Matthew 19 and verse 6, the scribes and Pharisees have come to Jesus and asked him if it is lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason. And notice in verse 6, Jesus, in answer to this, says, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." Here the scribes and Pharisees come to Jesus asking for his judgment regarding divorce. And when he says that what God has joined together is one flesh, we are not at liberty to separate. That's an act of violence, tearing apart one flesh. They say, well, then why did Moses command us to give a certificate of divorce? I want you to notice the word that they use. They say he commanded them to give a certificate of divorce. I think we'll see that's not exactly what he did. But Jesus says Moses allowed it or permitted it. He did not expressly prohibit it because of the hardness of their hearts. Not that that was the ideal, not that that's what God intended for all time, but God was regulating a practice that already existed. And so just because God is regulating some aspects of human brokenness within the law does not mean that he put his moral stamp of approval upon it. Look back at the passage that Jesus is actually referring to in Deuteronomy 24 for a moment. Deuteronomy 24 in verse 1 through 4, and I want you to pay attention to the structure of this law. It's going to be a very extended if-then statement. So I want you to keep your ears open for the then part of this statement. Okay? Deuteronomy 24, starting in verse 1, says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife, after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. I read through that rather quickly because this isn't the primary focus of our lesson tonight. But do you notice, if you were listening, it's if this, then this, if that, and this happens, then this is how you're supposed to handle it. God here was not commanding them to give a certificate of divorce. He's saying, if you do that, if you practice divorce, and this is how the situation goes, then this is the limit that I am setting upon it. Because of their hardness of heart, Jesus says, he allowed, he permitted, but he set some limits upon it and how they were to handle that practice. This is what we call case law. If this happens, then this is the limit. If this happens, then this is how you handle it, or this is the punishment. Let me give you another example of case law. Look in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 7. Deuteronomy 24 and verse 7, if a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then the thief shall die, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. There's another case law, an if-then statement. If you do this, this is how it's to be handled. Is God endorsing the first part of that? No, in fact, in this case, he says, if you do that, then you die, right? So just because there's case law where God says, if this happens, then these are the limits that I'm going to set, or this is the consequence for it, doesn't mean that God is endorsing what that practice is. Now, God is regulating much of what was common in the ancient Near East. And while at times he does not expressly prohibit it, he does set some limits upon it. He does set some consequences for it. And so we need to be careful that we don't see that, as the scribes and Pharisees did in Matthew 19, as God's stamp of approval upon that practice. You know, a modern example that we may be able to understand is if there is a law out there that prohibits late-term abortion, right? Prohibits third trimester abortion. Is that a bad law or is that a good law? Well, I think we would say, well, that's good, right? That there is a law out there that prohibits people from murdering their children in the third trimester of pregnancy. Does that law then endorse us murdering our children in the first 2 trimesters? Well, no, I think we would recognize that in the current cultural climate in which we live, we are trying to pass certain laws that will limit that practice and ultimately eliminate it. But that law is not intended then to endorse the practice of aborting a child at the earlier trimesters. I think we see similar things with what God does in certain laws where he sets a limit. Not that he means go up to this limit and that's okay, as long as you don't cross it. No, he is saying this is as far as I'm going to allow your brokenness to go before certain consequences come in. And so this may be somewhat similar to the concessions that God made in Israel's law as a nation regarding divorce, regarding polygamy, and even regarding slavery in the cultural climate of the ancient Near East. God is not endorsing these practices, but we will see he is going to set certain limits and certain consequences for them. And so the law absolutely did not promote slavery, but it did protect slaves. And that's what many of these laws regarding slavery are intended to do. Number one, in Exodus 21, we see that slavery within Israel was to be limited, and it was, if it was not limited, it was at least to be voluntary. Look at Exodus 21. We won't read this entire passage, but let's read verse 1 and 2. Verse 1 and 2, it says, "Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and the 7th he shall go out free for nothing." So here God is setting a certain limit upon this relationship of what we might even call indentured servitude. In certain situations, a Hebrew man or woman might find themselves in economic distress, might even sell themselves as a slave for their own economic benefit. But when that was done, it doesn't matter how much the debt was. It says you are limited to them serving you for 6 years, and then in the 7th they shall go free. Right? So it wasn't, if they owe you a whole lot, then you can go 14 years. No, he says, this is the limit, right? If they're going to sell themselves as a slave, then they were not to keep them as a slave any longer than those 6 years. And when they go out, their debt was to be considered fully paid, no matter how much that debt was when they sold themselves to begin with. If we continue in this passage in verse 3 through 6, we see that if that slave started a family while he was in this indentured servitude relationship, that didn't allow the other members of his family, his wife, to then change the terms of her servitude. And she was not allowed to go free earlier just because she got married to him. But she had to fulfill her term of servitude as well. But there is a situation where if he says, I love my master, and I love my family that I've started while I was here in the slavery relationship, he can voluntarily choose to stay in that relationship of servitude. If it's going to last longer than 6 years, it has to be his choice to commit himself. I think because of our country's picture of what slavery looks like, the idea that a slave would choose to say, I want to stay, sounds very foreign to us. But here you see, he says, I love my master, and I love my family that I've had here. And so he decides to stay. So it was either limited or it was voluntary. Now, verse 6 through 11 applies to a man who sells his daughter essentially in marriage. If you look in verse 7, we'll go ahead and read this. It says, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes her another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment or money. Essentially, he says, if you are taking a female slave into the family, she is to become a wife or a daughter-in-law. And if she's not treated as part of the family, if she is not given the full status, if she's treated as a second-class wife, he says, then she is to be set free. She is not allowed to be treated differently because she came from a place of economic hardship in which her family felt the need to sell her into that relationship. She is to have the full status of wife or of daughter in that relationship. And if not, then she was to be set free. Without any further payment of debt, and in just a moment we'll see what that setting free would actually have looked like. But I think specifically here, this is in a context where she is being given in marriage in that relationship. But look in Deuteronomy 15 and verse 12. Deuteronomy 15, starting in verse 12, we see, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. Now this sounds a little bit different than Exodus 21, I think because in Exodus 21 it was understood that she was being taken into the family as a wife. In this case, Hebrew man or woman, if she is simply entering a relationship of servitude, she is to be let free, just like the man, after the 6 years. And then continue reading with me in verse 13 through 15. It says, and when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your wine presses, as the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this today. Okay, so they were to serve for a limited period of time for 6 years, and when they set free, not only was their debt to be fully paid, regardless of how much that debt had been to begin with, not only that, they were not to simply let them go without giving them anything. They were to give them enough to help them start a new life. Do you see how God, in giving these laws, while not eradicating the relationship of slave to master, is showing great consideration for the one who finds themselves in this situation, where they need to sell themselves as a slave, that they are being provided for, they are being protected. As well, they were not to be treated simply as property. They were not to be ruled over. They were to be considered essentially employees. Look in Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25. And we'll read verse 39 through 43. Verse 39 says, "If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves." Okay, so we see the kind of situation that might lead to this. He's in economic hardship. He needs to be provided for, so he sells himself in this relationship with slavery, but he says, you don't treat him like a slave. No, you treat him like a hired worker. You care for him. You remember that you were slaves in Egypt. And so they were not to treat them as some piece of property, but as a fellow servant of the Lord. He was to be given value and dignity even in this position of misfortune. And in addition to being let go at the 7th year for an individual slave, not only that, but the year of Jubilee, which would happen on every 50th year. It doesn't matter if he had only served for 1 year or if he had served out his full 6 years. If the year of Jubilee comes, then you let him free as well, right? So multiple situations in which he is being set free. And this relationship, which is supposed to be more like employment, is limited by the old law. And additionally, kidnapping was a capital offense. We already saw this briefly in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 7. But Exodus 21 and verse 16 says this: "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." Brethren, if this passage were followed, the entire transatlantic slave trade would have been put to death overnight. Does the Bible endorse slavery as we saw it in this nation? Not in the least. No, it imposed the death penalty for anybody that was found kidnapping somebody and selling them to another. And there was protection against abuse for those who were in this relationship. Look in Exodus 21. Exodus 21 and verse 26 and 27. The law says, "When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth." Now again, this is case law. He's not saying it's okay to do this. No, he's saying, in fact, if you do this, then it doesn't matter how much debt they owe you. It doesn't matter how many more years they were supposed to serve you. If you cause some permanent damage to their person, you immediately let them go free. It's not encouraging any kind of beating or abuse. In fact, it is strongly discouraging it, knowing that any kind of permanent damage would cause them to lose the debt that this person had entered into slavery to pay, and free them from any further violence at their master's hand. You know, by contrast to this, the Code of Hammurabi permitted a master to cut off his disobedient slave's ear at no consequence whatsoever. In most ancient Near Eastern law codes, masters, not slaves, were to be financially compensated for the injury of their slave. Here in God's law, in contrast to the nations that surrounded them, if you hurt your slave, you let him go free in any permanent damage that is being caused here. There's one other passage, and this one, the way it's worded in our English translations is going to be a little bit harder for us to read. But let's look at Exodus 21, verse 20 and 21. It says, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. First of all, I want you to notice that first verse. If he were beaten, number one, if he's beaten in such a way that it causes permanent damage, he was to be set free. But number two, if he was beaten in such a way that caused his death, his life is to be valued as anybody else's life. There's no difference in value between a slave's life and some free man's life. No, if you kill him, then your life is to be taken. The death penalty is imposed because of the death of a slave. However, if that slave literally, the translation could be if he stands for a day or two. And so it was not an intentional murder situation. Then he is not to be avenged. The death penalty is not to be imposed upon him. Essentially what is being said here is that the economic loss of that slave was the punishment to be given in that case. And it's very similar to a law that was just stated in verse 18 and 19. It says, verse 18, when men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear, only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. So you see, we're making a distinction between where somebody is fully accountable for having caused the murder of this person in a situation where it was unintentional. It was to be an economic consequence rather than the death penalty. But again, it's not saying he is his property. It's he's losing the money that man owed him by now having to let his slave, in this case, his slave having died. And so all of these laws are not giving us the ideal, but they are setting limits. They are setting punishments. They are strongly discouraging any kind of abuse. We may not feel like this is going far enough. Just like we may not feel that prohibiting abortion in the third trimester is going far enough. But this is case law, not setting up the ideal. It's not set up to encourage abuse. In fact, the exact opposite. It's set up to strongly discourage it. If you know that your life could be forfeit if you beat your slave too excessively, and if you know that he must be released at the first sign of permanent damage, hopefully you're going to be much more cautious in giving out any kind of punishment to a slave. But additionally, runaway slaves were to be protected. Deuteronomy 23, verse 15 and 16 says, "You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, and the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him." And so this gives slaves, even those of other nations, a safe haven from unjust oppression and abuse. And the only provision in the law for slave ownership, per se, was for those acquired from other nations, which ultimately improved the situations of their servitude. In this case, there could be an involuntary lifelong service relationship, and yet, if this is somebody being sold from another nation, which is the only context in which this applied, in the other nation, he could have his ear cut off for doing something wrong with no consequence. In the nation of Israel, he is protected. He is not to be abused. Any kind of permanent damage causes him to be set free. We see what it means for him to be set free. He is to be fully provided for, that he could start a new life. And so, yes, there was the situation where those who were outside of God's covenant people could be in a lifelong slave relationship, but it would have been much more preferable than in any of the nations around them. And so this was not, this slavery relationship was not to be a dehumanizing relationship. It was not to be an abusive relationship. There are laws that limit that discourage it, that even pronounce the death penalty upon different aspects of that kind of abuse. You know, there may be some things in those laws that impress us, especially in contrast to the laws of neighboring nations and what was culturally accepted at the societies of that time. And there may be other aspects that trouble us about what the law permitted. But let's remember, the law was not the ideal. It was intended to pave the way for it. Just like God's law regarding divorce in Deuteronomy 24 was what God permitted because of the hardness of people's hearts, and not what he endorsed or encouraged. In the same way, his laws regarding slavery did the same. And so what do we see from the beginning? Just like Jesus said in Matthew 19, from the beginning it was not so. Well, what do we see regarding slavery from the beginning? Well, number one, we see that God gives great value and dignity and freedom to human life. In Genesis 1, verse 26 and 27, we see that each and every human life is imprinted with God's image. It doesn't matter where you are at economically. It doesn't matter where you are at culturally or ethnically. All human life is valuable because it is created in God's image. And notice what Job says in Job 31. Job 31, verse 13 through 15. Job recognized this principle. Job 31, verse 13 through 15. Starting verse 13, he says, "If I have rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb?" And so Job recognizes, based on the principles of creation, that just because he had a male servant or a maid servant didn't make them less valuable than him. And if they had some complaint to bring to him and he disregarded it, he said that would be morally wrong before God. God would judge him for that. No, he had to have the same care for them as for anyone else. And as we look at this pointing forward to the new covenant, the old law was looking forward to something better, to something new, a new kingdom. And in Joel 2, the passage that Peter quotes from on the day of Pentecost, when it talks about the pouring forth of God's Spirit, do you remember what he says? It says, "And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants in those days, I will pour out my Spirit." So the old law looking forward, these prophets looking forward, saw a day when the full fellowship of God, his Spirit being poured out on all flesh, would not just be to male, but also to female, would not just be to young or old, would not just be to free, but even to slaves. Doesn't matter your economic status. It doesn't matter where you fit into the culture of your time. No, God would make available his Spirit, fellowship with him, to all people. Galatians 3 and verse 28 says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free. There is no male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." There is no distinction in status or value before God's eyes within his kingdom. We are all equally his servants, the servants of a benevolent master who wants to take us even as his children within his household. We've talked primarily about the Old Testament and the laws that God set limiting and discouraging the abuse of any kind of slave or servant type relationship. And there's a lot more that we could say about the New Testament and its ideals, but I want us to end with this. We combat the brokenness of our culture by shining the light of a better kingdom. When Jesus came, his primary mission was not to dissolve the institution of slavery. As we said, at least in terms of indentured servitude, about 80 to 90% of the Roman Empire would have fallen in that category. I believe it's somewhere in the realm of 20% or 30% that would have been more chattel slavery. But Jesus' primary mission was not simply to change the kingdoms of this world and the cultures of this world. It was to start a new kingdom that didn't fit into the cultural or social mold of that world at all. And so in 1 Peter 2, read with me in verse 18 through 21. 1 Peter 2, 18 through 21. And we'll see what Jesus and the Holy Spirit here say to those who found themselves in this position. It says in verse 18, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps." As we said, Jesus' primary mission wasn't to eliminate all human oppression, wasn't to eliminate the institution of slavery in the world at that time. His primary mission was not political or social, but spiritual. And he calls us wherever we find ourselves, in the governments of our time and the politics and the social situations and culture of our time, that we shine the light of a better kingdom. And here, servants are encouraged that they have an opportunity to reflect the heart and character of Jesus in a very unique way here. Jesus was willing to suffer. He was willing to suffer injustice. This is not God endorsing that injustice, saying that it was okay, but encouraging those who find themselves in that situation. You can reflect the heart of Jesus, and you can shine the light of a better kingdom no matter what it is you have to suffer. And so, certainly, as hearts are changed by the gospel, there is no place for slavery to continue among God's people. And we need to be people who are supporting the value of every human life, who are proclaiming the ideals of Christ's kingdom. But we recognize, regardless of what the politics around us do, regardless of what the government, regardless of what the culture does, we are part of another kingdom. And we can shine that light, regardless of what it is that we may have to suffer. I know we haven't addressed every issue or answered every question tonight regarding slavery in the scriptures, but I hope at least we have showed that the old law regulated the brokenness and injustice of the ancient Near East culture in which it was written, and was a temporary fix, preparing the way for a much greater kingdom that we can be part of as fellow citizens today. In Christ's kingdom, there is not slave or free, there is not male or female, but we all equally have an opportunity of God's Spirit dwelling within us, a fellowship with him. And we ultimately all become slaves. We become slaves to a gracious master. We, as we talked about today in Matthew 11, we take on the yoke because our master is gentle and lowly in heart, and we will find rest for our souls. Are you willing to become a slave tonight? To become a slave of Jesus Christ? In Exodus 21, there's a picture where the slave says, "I love my master, and I love my family, and I don't want to go free. And he was to take an awl to that servant and pierce his ear at the doorpost to show I'm perpetually going to be a slave in this family. That's a picture of our relationship with the Lord. We love our master. We know that serving him is better than anything this world has to offer. And so we willingly give ourselves fully to be under his authority, to be his property, that we belong to him. If you're not a slave tonight, you need to become one. I hope these things have helped us to see God's intent and God's purpose. But let's honor the God that created us, honor the God that has shown us the true value of every human life, the God who is a benevolent and good and gracious master. If there's any way that we can help you in your relationship with the Lord, to become his servant, to become his slave, to come back to him if you have not been serving him, we want to offer you that opportunity now to ask for the prayers of these brethren, to confess some sin so that we can help you and encourage you in that, or to commit your life to the Lord the first time. If you're willing to bury your old life in the waters of baptism, by God's grace, you can be raised to live a new life tonight. If we can help you in some way, please make it known by coming forward as we stand and sing together.